Okay, well, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Happy Friday, and thanks for being here on the day before a long weekend. Today, we are covering the fourth in a series of 6 volunteer manager webinars. My name is Heather Burke. I'm the National Partnership and Volunteer Program Manager. And today's topic is going to be really fun and exciting. Everybody's favorite thing, in processing and paperwork. But, we're the government. We love our paperwork. We have a lot of forms, but they do serve a purpose. And we'll talk about each of them today and some other things to think about as you are in processing your volunteers. Just a reminder, it looks like everybody's on mute, so that's great. If you have questions, please feel free to type those in the chat as we go. I will monitor that. And then there'll be plenty of time at the end. I think this session will probably only take maybe 30 minutes, maybe less, which is great because it's Friday. Nobody wants to sit on a webinar a super long time on a Friday. So let's just jump right into it. First off, the basis of what we use for our volunteer program is a series of what's called the OF 301 forms. And these are not only used by the Corps of Engineers, these are also used by our sister federal land management agencies. So this is a standardized form that's used by the Park Service, Forest Service, BLM, Fish and Wildlife, BOR, NOAA, the Corps. So any volunteers that are working, serving for the federal government, land management agencies will be familiar with these forms. One thing of note, you will notice that the expiration date that's listed on the current form says that it expired in 2024. We have permission from the Office of Management and Budget, the ones who approve these forms, that we can keep using these. They are really backed up. We provided the updated forms to them. They're really only minor changes anyway, but we have to get these approved every 3 years. And with the DRPs and a lot of people leaving the government last year, OMB is backed up on a lot of their approval of forms. So we do have permission to keep using these. You just can ignore that it says the expiration date is 2024. And the purpose of this first set of forms, so the 301, there's the application, that's just the 301. There's the agreement, that's the 301A, and then there's a group form, 301B, and we'll go into each of these. The 301 application is just designed to gather information about a potential volunteer's interest in working for us. You can use it to screen applicants, develop a file of potential volunteers. This form is not required to be used. We have a lot of volunteers that just show up at our core projects and want to help out, or they come out for, say, a National Public Lands Day. They don't have to fill out an application. They only need to sign the agreement. But this is also what a volunteer is essentially filling out if they are applying for a job, a volunteer opportunity in volunteer.gov. It's just going to be a series of questions that ask these similar types of things. This form is also available right now in Mandarin, although once we update, it will not be replaced. And then there's also in Spanish as well. So the 301A, this is the volunteer agreement. This is required. All of our volunteers must sign an OF 301A. And this basically outlines that they understand what their duties are, any benefits that they may receive, like maybe a campsite or something like that, or coverage of expenses if we're going to pay for safety gear, anything that we reimburse them for, like mileage or food or transportation to originally get to the site. All of that is provided on this form. Now, the space on the form itself is small, so we just ask that you include an attachment that outlines the details of the duties. And the importance of this form is it provides protection to these volunteers. So if they get injured, they are protected by workers' comp and tort claims as long as this form has been signed. This is also available in Mandarin and Spanish. The Mandarin one will not be updated once we get the new forms. The Spanish will continue to be offered as an option. So the OF301A is the document that legally enrolls the individual, provides that protection, as I mentioned. It must be completed and signed prior to the start of the work by the volunteer, or if they have an organized group, by their group leader for every work project. And now this can be done electronically if you have advertised your volunteer position in volunteer.gov. Then the volunteers can just sign this form electronically, and the volunteer coordinators at the district or at the team member project level, if they've been given permissions, can sign this electronically. So you don't have to have the actual piece of paper going back and forth. So you want to have a complete detailed description of duties, responsibilities. We also need to have a job hazard analysis or position hazard analysis attached. And this is important, especially if something happens while the volunteer is on duty. It can help establish whether they were acting within the scope of their assigned responsibilities. And we do have examples on the gateway of various JHAs and PHAs. One thing to note, the OF301A, it's a living document, so it can be modified at any time. And you want to modify it if you've changed the duties of that volunteer at some point. Maybe they started out as a camp host, but then they decided they wanted to do trail work, or they wanted to do construction or something that wasn't originally in their duties. You definitely want to modify that. We do not have a requirement in our agency, like if you have volunteers that are working from year to year to year, the other agencies require that their OF301A forms are renewed after 1 year. We don't have that expiration, but like I said, if you should be looking at them, just making sure they're still up to date. And then once a volunteer is done, there's a line at the bottom of the form where you officially terminate their agreement. And that also is helpful to have that date and that signature, because if something happened to the volunteer, maybe after they were done and they put a claim in, you could show, hey, you were already done with your service. And if you got injured on our property after that, that wasn't part of your volunteer service. And the form remains in effect until terminated, should be reviewed periodically, as I said. And then a copy of that agreement should be given to the volunteer for their records. If this is done electronically through volunteer.gov, then they have that record. But if you're doing this in a paper version, just make sure to give a copy to that volunteer. And then we need to retain these for a 3-year period following the termination of a volunteer. So obviously, while they're serving for you, you'd have that paperwork, but even when they're done, we retain that for 3 years. And that's either if it's paper in a secured file cabinet, or electronically, it'd be electronically in a secured folder. If that's done through volunteer.gov, that's all secured. You use login.gov, you use your CAT card. So there's a lot of certificates and permissions that protect that information. And then just a note, volunteers who are members of a cooperating association for the Corps that have an official cooperating association agreement, they are required to provide liability coverage for any volunteers working for them. So they do not need to sign a 301A. Now they can, but they're not required to. I always like to say it's better to just go ahead and, even in those cases, have the volunteers sign those forms, because it just provides backup protection. It's kind of like secondary insurance. So it's not ever a bad idea, even when it's not a requirement, in an instance where there's that liability that's covered. And then the last form in the series of the OF301 forms is the 301B. And this is a volunteer group agreement, but it's only for groups that are all adults. So if they're part of a group, the leader would sign a 301A, and then all the other individual volunteers of that group could just fill out this simplified form with their name, email, phone number, sign it, and then they answer a couple questions there. If volunteers are under the age of 18, they must have their parent or legal guardian complete the full OF 301A. So we can't have children volunteers signing up on the group form. And again, this is standard across all the government agencies. This is not just something the Corps does. This is what all the federal land management agencies, how they process children volunteers. And then again, this is offered in Spanish and Mandarin currently. Mandarin will go away once we get these updated from OMB. I mentioned the job position or activity hazard analysis. Like anything, we really value safety as our #1 priority. So anything any kind of safety trainings or briefings that we provide to Corps personnel should also be provided to volunteers. And we do have a specific requirement for water safety training. And we've got some PowerPoint slides on the gateway related to water safety training for volunteers. Maybe take a quick break. I see there was a question. What about high school groups? So high school groups is if they're under 18, each of those students has to have an OF 301A signed by their parent or guardian. They can't be signed up on a group form. If they're over 18, if they're a senior in high school and they're 18, they could be on the group form. The form for volunteers under 18 is the OF 301A. It's that general agreement form that's used for volunteers. All right, turning back to JHAs. So those must be completed and signed by the volunteer coordinator or supervisor and the volunteer and saved with their OF 301A. If you're just doing some one-time tasks or events, you might have an activity hazard analysis. That's just a supplement, maybe something more specific. And we've had a group of volunteer coordinators helped put together examples of JHAs and PHAs on the gateway. So if you don't know where to start with these, you can go there and pull from those. A lot of good examples for specific types of work. This is what they look like: activity hazard analysis, job hazard analysis. And then if you have different forms that you're using at your project, we always like to give as many examples as possible. So please send those my way and I'll get those posted on the gateway so that people have options of what they might use with their forms. So one of the things we have to think about is whether we need to do background investigations on our volunteers. And we do have policy on this. It's in our ER 1130-2-500, Chapter 10, which is our volunteer chapter. And we just had a policy memo in January come out that provided some additional guidance, not on background investigations, but on purchase of recognition items. So this policy memo is actually what's in effect, but the background investigations information in the policy memo are exactly the same as what's in the ER. And we've got a matrix to kind of help you think through the different levels of when you might need to do a background investigation. So the first level is if you have a one-time event like Public Lands Day, or you have volunteers who are not working with minors without an adult or a Corps employee, or they're working less than 6 consecutive months and they don't meet any of the other scenarios in the level 2 or 3, then there's no background investigation required. If you want to do one, you could go through a local contractor, you could go through your security office in your district, run fingerprints, but it's not a requirement for that level of volunteer. The next level does require a fingerprint check, an FBI fingerprint check, and those are for volunteers who are working with unescorted access into controlled spaces. So basically, anywhere where you would issue a volunteer a key that the public wouldn't have access to, then those volunteers would at least have to have the fingerprint check. If they're accessing government files or records, like maybe they're helping out in the office, doing admin work, or in the visitor center, or at a gatehouse, and they're going to have access to PII and, public information, well, information about people that's not public, I suppose I should say. They would need that fingerprint check. And then if they're collecting and handling fees. And then the highest level of background investigation that requires not only the fingerprint check, but also needs to go through, basically fill out similar paperwork to what a full-time Corps employee would be, an SF 85 and an OF 306. And that gets processed through the District Security Office and through the Office of Personnel Management. These are volunteers who work more than 6 consecutive months, who maybe have regular contact with children under the 18 years without a parent or guardian or without Corps personnel, or if they require network computer access. So that's the highest level. And each of these things have different expiration dates on how long they last. One of the nice things is a couple of these are good for a lifetime as long as there hasn't been a 2-year break in service. So, once you've processed it, if they keep coming back year after year, you don't have to do these every year when a volunteer shows up. So fingerprinting, I mentioned level 2 and level 3 volunteers require fingerprinting, and that has to be processed through your district security office. A while back, we used to allow people to do these through outside contractors or vendors, but I guess 4 or 5 years ago, our security office said, no, that's not adequate enough. We need to run these through our offices. But the actual fingerprinting itself can be done at military bases, at Corps offices, district division project, recruiting centers, universities, other federal agencies, law enforcement offices. There's potential each year. Sometimes headquarters security office has some funding that they can purchase fingerprinting machines, and you can get those at your project. I know we've had a number of those placed around the Corps, and that's helpful so that volunteers don't have to drive as far to get their fingerprints taken. And then that's submitted through a web-based system. And then digital fingerprints are the preferred collection method. And I think nowadays most places have digital offered, but if not, we do have the option of the paper forms, the SF87 or the FD285. But again, those still need to go through your district security office, and then they transmit it to our personal security investigation center. So, there's procedures in place. This is what the fingerprint cards look like, just for your awareness, if you don't have the digital access. And then one of the things we put together, and this is on the gateway as well, we tried to put a list of everywhere we know we have fingerprint locations. So if you go looking at this list and you see that there's something missing, please let me know. We'd like to keep this as updated as possible. And that way, if you've got a volunteer, say you're in Idaho and you've got a volunteer coming from Florida, they're not going to drive all the way out, get fingerprinted, and then find out, oh, they've got something in their background that we can't bring them on. You'd want them to get fingerprinted somewhere in Florida where they lived. So you could look at this list. And then there's also a searchable list that Department of Justice and FBI have certified. It's through a private company, but they've been approved for federal background investigations. So you could go to this website as well. And sometimes this may, there may be a charge, and the volunteer can pay for that. You can reimburse them for that, or you can pay for it up front. Most of the places that are like Corps sites or police stations or military don't charge a fee. Do these locations all do electronic fingerprinting? The ones that are on that Certifix site are electronic. The ones that are on the spreadsheet, that this is just a little snapshot you can see here. Some you can see are paper only. So you just need to call and find out if you're looking to do the digital as much as possible. I mentioned for those volunteers in that level 3, that highest level of background investigation, they need to do the questionnaire for non-sensitive positions and the 306 for federal employment. Even though they're volunteers, they still are having to fill out very detailed information. But again, it's based on the level of essentially security risk and public safety that you want to make sure that they are good to go. And one thing that I will add before I go into network computer access, it's not a bad idea also to do like social media searches on people or just internet searches on people, because sometimes you may find information out that doesn't show up on a background investigation, but might, make someone not appropriate for being in our parks or just in public service. So that's just a good rule of thumb. It's not a requirement, but not a bad idea just to see who you're going to have representing the Corps of Engineers when they come and work in our parks. So network computer access, we do have the capability, if you need a volunteer, to access and connect to a Department of Defense network. We used to have something called VOLACs, Volunteer Logical Access Credentials. About a year or two ago, that changed to something called a NEATS token card. There's no cost to get that NEATS token, but there might be cost with maybe getting fingerprints and those background checks. If a volunteer is just using a standalone computer that doesn't need the DoD network, they don't need this NEATS token. And there is quite a bit of process. I'm not going to go through each of these steps, but you can thank our folks at Carter's Lake in Georgia. Were the first ones to help us work through this new process and figure out the steps. So basically, there's the forms that the volunteers will need to fill out. You need to coordinate with your district volunteer coordinator and your district security office. The information is going to be put into a credentialing system. There's going to have to be UPass request. There's a lot of back and forth that goes into this process. Like the volunteers will have to go in and I'll go to the next slide. They'll need to complete some trainings. There's a Corps employee that has a CAC card will need to initially log in with that volunteer to get their NEATS token card working. Use of Active Client. There's a lot of steps, but thankfully the hard work has been done for you initially in trying to figure this out. So and if this process changes and you work through this and hit a wall on this, let me know. I have not personally processed one of these, so I can't speak to all of these steps, but there are folks out there, some of our volunteer coordinators have done this, and you can definitely learn from them as they've gone through it. As far as volunteers using government property, we do have examples. This one's from Walla Walla, but they put together a nice form that can be used when you're loaning property to volunteers while they're working for you, a property control receipt, and then just marking the condition of it, if any damages occurred. Basically, this is just a record, so you know what's gone out with a volunteer and what you're getting back when they're done with their service. This is another example that I pulled from Walla Walla for handling fees. They have their volunteers sign this form. It's basically pulled from the regulation that they understand that they're handling money and they're responsible for that money. We used to require volunteers to get bonded, but that requirement went away about 10 years ago or so. So we just have them sign an acknowledgement that they are responsible for that money. And if that money disappears, gets lost, stolen, they're responsible for that. Okay, volunteer safety. I mentioned before safety training, but then safety equipment is also something that we will provide. and we can purchase it, or the volunteer can purchase and get reimbursed as long as it's been authorized in advance by the volunteer coordinator. And volunteers can also get immunizations if those are provided to Corps employees. So like if you provide flu shots or COVID shots or hepatitis shots to your park rangers, you could also provide those to your volunteers if you feel like they would be exposed to any of those things. We will not use volunteers in work assignments where Corps personnel would receive hazardous duty pay, but I don't know that there's a whole lot of work that would fall under that category, but that is our policy. And then we do encourage that our volunteers join our staff's weekly or monthly safety meetings. And then again, they must be trained how to properly use water safety rescue equipment and techniques. If a volunteer is injured, it's reported in the same manner as those injuries involving Corps personnel. And they are entitled to first aid and medical training, hospital care. If we need to transport the volunteers and they have to pay for it, we can reimburse them for that. If there's a death from an on-the-job injury, we can provide burial and funeral expenses, but that is regulated by the Office of Workers' Compensation. That's not something that we decide. And that's similar with any injuries of a volunteer. You would process the paperwork through workers' comp, and they would determine what compensation the volunteer would get back. And then since we don't pay the volunteers, even if they have paid jobs and they get injured as a volunteer and they maybe can't make it to their regular job, we cannot compensate them for those lost wages from their regular job. We can compensate them for their injuries while working for us, but not for lost wages in their regular life. One other thing, this was something that came out of one of our previous webinars that a volunteer coordinator put together, and I thought it was a nice thing to add. When you bring a volunteer on, a lot of times they may have never volunteered before. They might not know what they should bring with them. And so with onboarding and processing, it can be helpful to provide them a list of items they might want to bring or what is provided by the Corps. And you can modify this. This was just something a person put together from one of our lakes, but it's a good starting point. You know, we do have volunteers that are experts. I mean, they volunteer all over the country, different agencies, different Corps parks, but then folks that are coming on new or starting from scratch, it's always helpful to give them information like this to get them started. So I've mentioned it a number of times, and I mention it in every webinar that I give, but we put all this information on the NRM Gateway. So the volunteer program page has tons of information, tons of examples, forms, documents, so that you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can learn from others and basically cut and paste wherever possible. So be sure to use that. Myself and the Partnership Advisory Committee keep these pages updated almost daily. I'm sending updates to our webmaster, Jeannie Dickerson, so that the information is current and relevant. But it's hard to monitor every single link. So if you find broken links or you find information that seems a little off, please let me know so that we can fix that as well. So last slide, just a reminder, with 2 more of these webinars that are coming up in March. So on orientation, training, incidental expenses and reimbursements, and then evaluation and awards and SWIBI data entry. So be sure to make those if you can. This webinar has been recorded and I will post it on the Gateway along with the slides. I'll also post the slides in the chat history in Teams, so you'll be able to access both there as well. So with that, I will open it up for any other questions.